Why don't we get started? My name is Drew Bush. I'm the Assistant Director at the Old Stone House Museum, and I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight for our first night of Old Stone House Week. I hope, of course, that you had a nice dinner before you hopped on Zoom here to be with us. In a moment, I'll turn things over to our dynamic and exciting speaker, Shanta Lee Gander. I just wanted to give you a few tips on using Zoom with us tonight before we get there. Of course, we would be love to be celebrating Old Stonehouse Day with you in person, but we're really excited to be able to bring you this series over this week with the presentation tonight that will continue with new and different offerings over the next few nights until Saturday. So for those of you who are watching here in Zoom, there's a couple ways you can interact with us tonight. We're going to ask that you try to hold your questions for the end of tonight's presentation. But the way that you can actually go about asking them is if you mouse your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a chat box. And if you click on that, you'll actually see a little welcome in there for me. You can always chat to me during the presentation. So if you're thinking about something and you don't want to hold on to the thought until the end of the talk, please feel free to put it in there. You can also do the same. You'll see a button down at the bottom. That is our Q&A button too. So those Q&A questions, we'll try to answer them live in the session, probably at the end. But if we can, we'll answer them in written form in there too. And then the final way that you can interact with us tonight for Old Stone House Week is you can actually also raise your hand. So you'll see that little hand icon at the bottom of your screen. And you can use that to share your video and audio. I'll actually get a little notice on my side that you've raised your hand, and I will then actually promote you, and you will be able to talk directly with us. One thing to keep in mind, though, if you are interested in asking a live question, is that we are recording tonight's video for those who can't make it tonight so that they can watch afterwards. So just be aware that if you share your video, you'll be a part of that recording. So without further ado, I now want to turn things over to Shanta.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm going to put this on share screen. Give me a sec. And let's see. Okay, I have that on share. So I'm Shanta Lee Gander, and I am going to be talking about bearing witness and the endurance of voice in regards to Lucy Terry Prince. First, I'm going to open with the recitation of Bars Fights and introduce the poem. And then we will have some time to talk about the context of the poem, Lucy Terry Prince's life, and hearing more about who she was. So I'd like to bring you Bars Fight. August 'twas 25th, 1746. The Indians did an ambush lay, some very valiant men to slay, the names of whom I'll not leave out. Samuel Allen like a hero fought, and though he was so brave and bold, his face no more shall we behold. Eliza Hawk was killed outright, and though he had chance to fight, sorry, excuse me a second. Elijah Hawk was killed outright, and before he had a chance to fight, before he did the Indian see, was shot and killed immediately. Oliver Amson, he was slain, which caused his friends much grief and pain. Simeon Amson was found dead, not many rods distant from his head. Adonijah Jaleh, we do hear, did lose his life, which was so dear. John Sadler fled by water and thus escaped the dreadful slaughter. Eunice Allen saw the Indians coming and thought she could escape by running, and had not her petticoats tripped her, those awful creatures would not have caught her and tommyhawked her on the head, leaving her on the ground for dead. And young Samuel Allen, oh lackaday, he was taken and carried to Canada. So that is the poem, and I do apologize. I think there's something about being recorded that was just like, It's live. So I do apologize for that. What I'm going to do now is take you through some context of Lucy Terry Prince's life. So we do believe that Lucy Terry Prince was most likely born between the years of 1724 and 1726 in West Africa. She was stolen between the years of 1728 and 1730. It's an estimation, and brought to the area which is now known as Rhode Island, but then it was known as Bristol, Massachusetts, near Providence. It was the largest slave trading port outside of the South. She's later sold to another owner, Samuel Terry, with whom she likely lived in Minden, Massachusetts. And then there's a period where she's transferred over, she's sold to Reverend Ebenezer and Abigail Wells. They did not have any children at the time. She is at this point in Deerfield, Mass. And so this is the house. I think it's now in Easter egg blue. It's a different color now. But this photo shows the house, which is in historic Deerfield, Mass. And at the time, 38% of Deerfield's households included slaves. They referred to slaves as servants in that area. So to give you, I'm going to minimize my screen here. Here we go. So to give you an idea of the climate of Lucy Terry Prince's life, you have in 1735 that Lucy is officially recognized as a resident of Deerfield and is baptized in their local church. Lucy Terry Prince and Abija Prince. She also worked in the tavern as a part of her duties. She is known as an orator and a storyteller. Most likely she comes in contact with Abija, who's passing through during that time. They both become freed under different circumstances while living in Deerfield, Mass. So Lucy becomes freed because when Ebenezer dies, when her owner dies, he does not count her along with what he's left behind. And so therefore she was considered free. While in Deerfield, Abija is acquiring land both in Guilford, Vermont and Sunderland, Vermont. In 1775, they relocate their land. They go and they have their homestead with their family in Guilford, Vermont. They, over time, end up with 6 children that they are raising on their land. Within a few years of being there, they are harassed by John Noyes. Lucy argues her case not once but twice in the highest court in Vermont. Now, the highest court in Vermont at the time is called the Governor's Council. And so she goes there in 1785 to argue for her rights, to argue for land protection. And not only does she win, but they also send notice to the Guilford Select Board to say, you know, we need to protect the princes, keep an eye on this situation. Unfortunately, the harassment did not stop. At some point before Abija dies, he sells off some of the land. There's still some that's kept while Lucy is still alive with the rest of their children. And then she goes back to the highest court of the land to argue for her land in Sunderland, Vermont. It was a very wild time where if you had land, it could well happen that your parcel land that you thought you owned could also be resold or given away, and all sorts of kinds of dealings like that. So what happens is she argues and she wins the $200 towards basically trying to help with her living circumstances, but she also lets Sunderland, Vermont know that they owe her a place to live, and so she is also granted that as well. The other thing about this circumstance, and one of the things I'm always careful for to deconstruct, is around our legacy as it relates to the state of Vermont, as it relates to our stance on slavery. One of the mythologies we always like to say is, you know, Vermont declared slavery, like outlawed slavery. But when you take a closer look at its language, the language was way flimsier than that. Notice that I say that it was adult slavery that was outlawed, which means that children could still be enslaved. Child labor also could still be used and manipulated in many different ways. You also have evidence, and this is all unearthed by Dr. Harvey Amani Whitfield's essay with primary resources. It's called A Problem of Slavery in Early Vermont, 1777 to 1810. So it's very interesting. There's a quote I want to read you. In 1786, the Vermont legislature stated the idea of slavery is expressly and totally excluded from our free government. The more I dig into a lot of history, the more I realize that a lot of the residue from things hundreds of years ago happen to still be with us. So that may also be some of the reasons why we believe that Vermont has been more ideal about race, because of some of this, the tales we've spun about it. So we have things like, for example, this ad that you see. Dr. Whitfield poses the question, if we didn't have a problem with slavery, why did we have an environment in which newspaper and slave owners could post ads for one to raise slaves? They must have had an audience for that here. 1789, you had a debate about whether or not, and this was in the Bennington Friendly Society, whether or not individuals should be helped if they ran away. Should they be given back to their masters, or should they be helped by individuals in Vermont? Six individuals believed that they should be helping these individuals, and 5 other individuals on this group disagreed with that. They thought those individuals should be given back to their masters. So I just want to give you a sense of some of the climate of what we're dealing with, and also the contradiction of what we like to think about when we think about Vermont, the landscape of race. You also, during this time, you had the French and Indian War, you had the American Revolutionary War, so there's a lot of fighting. You had Ethan Allen. I've always thought this was a fascinating fact, that Ethan Allen returns. He was held for 3 years by the British. And he was caught because he tried to capture Montreal. So if you could imagine how wild things were, but also how much African Americans at that time were on shaky ground. We do not see anti-slavery societies until around the 1830s. This is something we rarely think of. So the anti-slavery societies were societies that helped to aid in protecting African Americans. There were cases in which, for example, African Americans who were free were sold into slavery, or people being kidnapped back into slavery. So those are some key things to keep in mind. Also, there's the case of Dinah and Judge Stephen Jacob. So in 1783, he purchases Dinah. And by 1802, he is sued. She's 47 years old and ill around that time. He turns her loose. She can no longer be of use as his slave. And he's sued. The select board of Windsor tries to sue him, but not because he did anything illegal. They're not looking at that. They're looking at the fact that they want to be reimbursed for taking care of Dinah, because Dinah has had to rely on the town because she had no place to go, and he just put her out. So the select board of Windsor wanted to introduce the bill of sale of Judge Stephen Jacob, and his peers did not allow it. So again, these are other things to just keep in mind as we think about Vermont's history, and more or less question some of the stories that we tell ourselves about our relationship in history around race here. So then we have Vermont becoming a state in 1791. U.S. Congress votes to admit Vermont into the United States. Then you have, so to give you more information just about Barr's fight and a bit about Lucy and how she wrote that. So August 25th, 1746, I believe that was 40 years after the first raid happened, or a previous raid. I don't want to say the first raid until I double check that, but a previous raid happened in Deerfield. So um, that birthed Barr's fight. Now it's kind of unclear whether or not she actually directly witnessed it or heard people talking about it, but either way, that was her way of bearing witness to what was going on in the environment. So this raid included 60 Abenaki men who were under a French commander. Forgive my French, it's way horrible. Commander Vaudreuil. And bars is a colonial word for meadow. I know in current context, I always want to clarify to people we're not talking about people slinging chairs or anything like that in an actual traditional bar as we think of it in modern life, but bars in terms of the meadow. And what happens is these Abenaki men are hiding. They're waiting for the two families. There's the Allen family, the Amsden family, as mentioned and named in the poem, and they launch their attack. So Barr's fight is written in the form of a ballad, and if some of you either are poets or know about poetry, there there's some belief that ballads are like usually within poetry bearers of bad news. Like they're meant to be memorized. They're also, it's very it's not uncommon for ballads to also carry a lot of the weight of some gritty things. So, for example, and this is just fun to look up on your own time if you're into this kind of thing, there is a whole area or arrangement of something called murder ballads, and those involve ballads that were written that cover some unfortunate incidents, like in various parts of history. So, I always find that just fascinating. Barr's fight, it survives for approximately 100 years in oral tradition before it appears on the front page of the Springfield Republican in 1854. So again, it's something that gets passed down, and I always find it interesting to think about transmission. The unfortunate thing is we don't know of other poems that Lucy may have written. We know paper back then for everyone was quite expensive, so we're not sure about that. But when in thinking about her legacy in terms of bearing witness, we have this poem, but we also have her arguing her case before the highest court in Vermont twice. So very much being a self-advocate, very much looking at the law and saying, and knowing her rights and going to fight for her rights. So let's go to actual looking at Barr's fight. So as you think about questions that you may want to ask towards the end, I do want to point out a couple of interesting facts. So Eunice Allen, notice and left her on the ground for dead. Now, if you know nothing else, that is a tip off in terms of what we know about Eunice Allen. Eunice Allen did survive, and she, in later years, talks about the incident as vivid as anything. She talks about the incident, and the other thing is young Samuel Allen. So he is eventually fetched by an uncle. When his uncle comes and gets him, which I find, so this is fascinating, but not uncommon for that time. So it was common for when people, not everybody, but when some of the kidnappings happened or some people were taken prisoner or held hostage by Native Americans, some did not want to return back to their families, or they looked upon that time very fondly. There is a lot of writing that comes out of that period about that phenomena. So Samuel Allen at first pretends he's forgotten English, that he doesn't understand English. He is pressed and pressed until he's forced to come back with his uncle. And until old age, he looks upon that time of being captured fondly. So again, that sentiment is not uncommon to others who've written about that. So looking at Lucy Terry Prince's legacy, there is a whole range of bearing witness and thinking about the ways, not just necessarily for Black poets, but also thinking about the poetry of witness in general. And I like to say that Lucy Terry Prince is within the pantheon of that. There's a lot, and we'll get to this towards the end, but there's a lot about her life that reminds us or is a guiding light for so many things. So as we think about her bearing witness, this is within the constellation of Phyllis Wheatley, for example, who publishes her first book of poems by an African American. Lucy Terry Prince is known as the first known African American in English literature, because Bars Fight predates this. But it's key to know that a lot of different individuals have been bearing witness in so many different ways. To go a bit more modern, even though we're still we are in the early 1900s at this point, but within, let's say, the 20th century, here's Langston Hughes, and I will play this. It gives an example of, again, poetry of witness, and I'll just play this. Take a couple minutes.
This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems, written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time, my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
So again, you have this, you have the naming and recording of history in a different way, but also still very much a bearing of witness. Here is something even more modern, another example by poet, spoken word artist Siobhan Johnson. And this involves another different take or perspective on bearing witness, or at least poetry and spoken word through bearing witness. So here we go.
So I have a favorite nephew, and it's very clear. Like my nieces and I'm honest. He's my favorite. We get along well. He's the only one that has a drawer full of things in my house. The other ones have to bring their stuff. He could just come right now. I don't care. That's how I live. He's competed for my affection and he won. He was the champion. Yes, he was. I'm going to make my own kids compete for my affection when I have them. No, here I go. So I'm driving down the street with my 4-year-old nephew. He knocking back a juice box, me a Snapple. Today, y'all, we are doing manly stuff. I love watching the way his mind works. He asks a million questions. Uncle, why is the sky blue? Uncle, how do cars go? Uncle, why don't dogs talk? Uncle, uncle, uncle. He asks uncle, uncle, uncle. He asks uncle as if his voice box is a warped record. I try my best to answer every question I do. I say it's because the way the sun lights up the outer spaces, because engines make the wheels go. It's because their minds aren't quite like ours. I say yes, no, no, yes, no. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe. He laughs at me. He smiles, looks out the window, spots a cop car and says, "Oh man, Uncle, 5-0, we gotta hide." I'll be honest. I'm not happy with the way we raise our black boys. Don't like the fact that he learned to hide from the cops well before he knew how to read. Angrier that his survival depends more on his ability to deal with authorities than it does his own literacy. Get up, I yell at him. In this car, in this family, we are not afraid of the law. I wonder if he can hear the uncertainty in my voice. Is today the day he learns that Uncle is willing to lie to him? That I'm more human than I am hero. See, we both know the truth is far more complex than do not hide. Both know too many black boys who disappeared, names lost. Know too many Trayvon Martins, Oscar Grants, and Abner Louimas. Know too many Sean Bells and Amadou Diallos. Know too well that we are the hard-boiled sons of Emmett Till still. We both know it's not about whether or not the shooter is racist. It's about how black boys are treated as problems well before we're treated as people. Black boys in this country can't afford to play cops and robbers if we're always considered the latter. Don't have the luxuries of playing war if we're already in one. Where I'm from, seeing cop cars drive down the street feels a lot like low-flying planes in New York City. Where I'm from, routine traffic stops are more like minefields. Any wrong move could very well mean your life. And how do I look my nephew in his apple face and tell him to be strong when we both know black boys who are murdered every day simply for standing up for themselves? I take him by the hand, I say, be strong. But be smart and be kind and polite and know your laws. Be aware of how quickly your hand moves to pocket for wallet or ID. Be more aware of how quickly an officer's hand moves to holster for gun. Be black, be a boy, have fun, because this world will force you to become a man far more quickly than you'll ever need to. He lets go of my hand, but Uncle, he asks. Eyes are as big as tomorrow, but Uncle, he asks, what happens if the cop is really mean? And it scares me to know that he, like so many other boys, is getting ready for a war I can't prepare him for. Thank you.
Okay, it's always hard to get back. Okay, oops. Okay, so that just gives you just a small snippet of examples. I've done whole workshops just based specifically on poetry of witness and what does that look like. So like I said, Lucy Terry Prince fits in within the pantheon of bearing witness and using words to bear witness through poetry. The other thing I want to point out in terms of implications of Lucy Terry Prince's story are a couple of really key things and some things to put into perspective. So one main point, for example, there's a book I don't know if you can see it. This is Gretchen Holberger-Zena's book about, and the full title is Mr. and Mrs. Prince, How an Extraordinary 18th Century Family Moved Out of Slavery into Legend. She does a really great job of debunking some of the legends and mythology around the princes. And so I would strongly encourage anybody to read that book, and it's just really fascinating to hear and be taken on the journey of how Gretchen did her research. So one of the things that I also gathered out of this, and also other things that I've read, is our broadened understanding of slavery, the institution of slavery in other places. I know that most of us, when we learn about slavery or talk about slavery in America, it's usually very much focused on the South and not looking at places like, for example, what was slavery like in the West? What was slavery like in the North? It is believed that Noyes, who was the main person who was harassing the princes, is from, or was from, a part of Connecticut that had slaves, that had plantations. It's believed that he was used to seeing African Americans in a certain station in life, and so not quite and quite racist again in his harassment and in wanting their land and wanting to drive them away from land. But in telling the story of the princes, Gretchen also helps to broaden our understanding of slavery in the North. However, we have to be careful not to romanticize any of the difference, and she's very clear on that. Slaves, it was very common for slaves to be taught, trained in different trades, but of course in things that would benefit their owners. It was common for slaves to be able to travel between different borders, sometimes bear arms, again, and benefit to their owners. So the institution looked a bit different, but still very much within the grotesque institution of slavery. For example, I always think about the word, servants, calling the slaves in Deerfield, Mass. Servants as opposed to slaves, and recognizing that they were slaves who weren't servants. They were there, they were purchased. Another key point in terms of deepening our understanding and legacy of land ownership and African Americans. This is actually, I have a couple of links I could share with individuals if they're interested that I can get to Drew, or that can be posted on the site, that talk about the legacy of land ownership. So Lucy, years after Lucy and Abija both pass, between 1865 and 1910, they are within a constellation of individuals who own land, African-American individuals who own land. Freed slaves and descendants owned about 15 million combined acres during that period. By 1920, you had 14% of all farms were Black owned. Fast forward between that period and today, African Americans own less than 1% of rural lands, which is it is jaw-dropping, and for a whole range of reasons. Think about the Great Migration, for example, in which individuals were in a lot of cases fleeing for their lives, fleeing from harassment, needing to save their families, sometimes running from land, sometimes being run off land. So those are different things to keep and take into perspective. And like I said, I can definitely share some of the resources and articles for that and reading more about that. There's also illuminating the role and the voice of African Americans in early America. It's very important that we try to, and it involves some deciphering of texts. So I'll give you an example. My undergrad is in women, gender, and sexuality at Trinity College. And one of the things I was very familiar with, it's not quite a memoir, but it's like more like confessional. Fanny Kemble, who was a mistress, married someone, lived on a plantation. I think she was a former actress of sorts. And so I was very familiar with her and very familiar with the argument or the idea that white women, that was floated, that white women were also victims of the same institution. However, we need to do more digging, and very much in the same way that I talked about doing more digging and talking about the way that Vermont struck slavery from its constitution, and like doing more digging underneath that, like really looking at all the pathways to that, you learn that actually these mistresses just as guilty and accountable as the masters. There were cases in which women would take their husbands to court because they wanted to keep access to their own slaves, manage their own property, and not have, whether it was creditors or their husbands coming after what they had ownership of. There's a great book that came out last year, I want to say January. It's called They Were Her Property. A really amazing book. If you've not read it, read it. I would highly suggest it. So again, and in that book, it talked about some cases where slaves knew that they would be freed upon the death of their mistress. And so there's a case, for example, of a woman who basically is able, goes to court, and she wins because after the death of her mistress, she's passed along, and she's like, wait a minute, no, I'm supposed to be free. There's another case, there's a book called Sweet Taste of Liberty, a true story of slavery and restitution in America by W. Caleb McDaniel. And it tells the story of Henrietta Wood. So Henrietta Wood was freed, and then she was kidnapped and tricked back into slavery. After the Civil War, she sues and wins. She originally sued for, $20,000. She wins $2,500 of that. By today's standards, it would be worth $56,000. She was able to put her son through college with that and live a comfortable life. But I'm bringing these examples to light because similar to Lucy, there are so many other voices of African Americans who were fighting for their rights or knew that they deserved better and they were going to get better. Also, the other bigger picture of looking, or in addition to that picture of fighting for one's rights, it's all about the whole concept of who had voice, who's building early America. Let's think about this. Let's, again, deconstruct some of the things that we think about when we think about early America. Who were the players? Who were the narrators? I mean, we all know who's gotten to narrate. And I think that it's been a very interesting time, not just in this moment, but I would argue maybe over the past 20 years, maybe longer, of deconstructing narrative and really questioning, well, was it really that way? Or are there some other missing voices that we just are not paying attention to, that we need to pay attention to ask critical questions? So what I'm going to do is stop the screen share now and make this, I'd love to open up for questions and conversation. I really love, I love all parts of presenting this, but I really appreciate hearing what people have to say. And there are always some interesting conversations and dialogues and food for thought. So I want to open it up.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to remind folks how you can share your thoughts. If you are on a computer, you can scroll to the bottom of your little Zoom screen, and there's a chat and a Q&A button. We'd love to have your thoughts in our chat, your questions in our Q&A. You can also, if you want, raise your hand. You'll see a button down there too. I think if you're on an iPad or on a tablet, all three of these buttons are probably at the top of your Zoom screen. But feel free to click on any of those areas and I'll get pinged, and then I can promote you to be able to either share your screen and talk with Shanta, or you can, or I'll pose your question for you if you put it in our Q&A and in our chat. And maybe I'll start off with a question, Shanta. I'm wondering, how did you first get engaged in this kind of work, through poetry, through this reclamation of voice, through what people have been writing, over our history? I'm interested. What sparked you?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, and I say this embarrassingly. I'm never shy about what I don't know. So I've been a New Englander. I'm originally from Connecticut, and I've never heard of I've never heard anything about Lucy Terry Prince, right? And so in 2016, I've always been one to be very interested in digging and looking at different facets of history of different things. And following different rabbit holes, if you will. In 2016, I was approached by Lissa Weinman, who is connected with the Brattleboro Words Project. The Brattleboro Words Project is a part of a bigger, got 3-year funding from the National Humanities Council, and to look at the history of people, places, as it related to words, literature, looking at, for example, Abenaki communication and language, looking at Lucy Terry Prince, looking at these lesser known voices. Lucy Terry Prince was the first one out of the Words Project, and she approached me and she said, do you know Lucy Terry Prince? Like, because we have Abija Prince Road. And so she was like, Lucy Terry Prince, she should be known in her own right. She was so accomplished. And so she was like, you should read this book. Tell me what you think. You should be Lucy. And I was just sort of like, I was thinking, I read the book, and I like to say Lucy chose me. Like, Lucy somehow came, found me, and I'm very respectful because we don't know much about her life. I like to be respectful around the material and how I engage with it. So not quite being her, but just doing respect to her words and bringing those to life through her poetry, through the one poem that we have. So that's how I came in contact with Lucy Terry Prince. And so I've continually have been fascinated by the different facets, and looking at, for example, one of the questions that someone raised, or the point that it was a poet that raised this, was about her writing for white gaze. Like, why, like the way, like if you think about the presentation of Native Americans, or the certain tone throughout the poem, and what would that poem look like if she didn't have to think about white gaze in terms of, the thought around Native Americans and the belief systems. Like, what would that even look like? And it's a very fascinating question I've been thinking about for months now.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
Yeah.
We have one person raising their hand because I think they want to ask a question. So Joan, I'm going to, you'll get a little ping on your end on Zoom. I just allowed you to talk. So
I think they just have to unmute.
Just have to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question.
Awesome.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, thank you. I write a Civil War newsletter. I've been doing that since 2004, and I enjoyed your talk. And I had heard of the Princes before, but I really didn't know much about them, so I'm very happy to hear more about them. And I just was wondering if I can use this in my Civil War newsletter. And also, can I view this whole talk again later for more to take notes and so forth?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I can take your second question, and then I'll let Shanta take the first one.
Okay.
You can definitely view this whole talk. It's actually being live streamed right now on YouTube, but it will be up on our website on YouTube as well. So the same page as where you found the registration for tonight. We'll have the video up there probably by this time tomorrow, if not much earlier in the day.
Okay. If I have a problem, I'll let you know.
Okay.
But it's okay to use it in my newsletter?
Yes, absolutely. And also, there's a narrative version of detail of how things unzipped during the bars fight. So I can send that information as well as a snippet out of Gretchen's book. I'll make sure to send that information to Drew.
Oh, great. That would be I would thank you very much.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you so much. And let me know. I'll make sure Drew has all my contact information, because if anybody wants to further email me, contact me, call me, you're more than welcome.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you. And there was someone put something in chat about the links for land ownership. Yep, I definitely will be sharing those links, of course. And let's see, was there a movement to cities, possible jobs in the 1920s that led to less land ownership by African Americans? That is amazing, decrease in ownership. So yeah, I would say there was the Great Migration, which lasted for several decades. There is a book by Isabel Wilkerson. This is actually making me think I should just put together a reading list to share. And it would not be exhaustive at all, but it would be something of some of the resources that I've either engaged with or that help to provide some information. So Isabel Wilkerson, it's called The Warmth of Others' Suns. She just came out with another book afterwards too, which is like recent, very recent. But this other one focuses on, I believe it follows either 3 or 4 families and the Great Migration and their different reasons. But it's, again, it's within a constellation. Like I knew of a family that was impacted and were a part of the Great Migration, having their property destroyed and needed to uproot and go and restart. My family is within the Great Migration, you know, coming up from the South. My father's family originally from Ohio and then came to the Northeast. So yeah, it's really fascinating. I definitely will share. Let me make note of that book. I'll make sure that's all shared.
I can definitely, just to follow up on what you're saying, I can definitely make sure that everybody who registered tonight gets an email from us afterwards, so it has a reading list with links and anything else. Maybe I can follow up on the question Carmen was asking, and I think what she maybe is trying to get at is just what kind of resources do you use to think about land ownership, and how wealth is built over time.
That's a very good question, and it's a very complicated one because it depends. Well, it depends on how you're accessing the answer to that. So, for example, there is, what's the name of the book? The book is something like What Your History Teacher Never Taught You or Told You, or something like that. And it talks about some of the expeditions that people went on to go look for, whether it was gold, silver, whatever. That was one strain in which people were able to pass things on to their generations and to their family and like keep money in. There also was, what was I reading? Actually, now this is very exhaustive, but it's really good primary resource. So the WPA, it was under the government, they collected a lot of ex-slave narratives. There were all these interviews that were done in the early 20th century, and it's exhaustive. Like you could click on a state and it has several different parts, and you can read the stories specifically. And some of what I've noticed in reading that, I can send the link for that too, if people just want to root around and look at some of those. What was interesting is it talked about how people, beating the slave masters, they were trying to hold on to some of their wealth. One slave master sent his son, who he owned, to England to hide his money. So what was happening after the Civil War and after the Yankees were going around, there's a whole range of activity, whether it was ransacking or demanding food or, demanding where's the money, like you have some money, and going and literally taking things and also telling slaves, hey, you're free. And there were all sorts of different scenarios where some families hid things so that they could go back and find their money, their valuables. So there's that. So I would say it's almost scattered. There are lots of really interesting history books that will tell you. Jill Lepore, she has this, I mean, it's honging. It's huge. It's one of those that I can't read. I'm not going to read in one sitting, but you go back and you try to read sections, and it talks about a whole range of history. So I would say it's a bit not scattered as if it hasn't been covered. It totally has been. I would also say then there's the question of, so if we take Salem, for example, and the witch trials, there was some talk about the ways that the inspiration to go after people in some cases also involved getting a hold of their land, getting a hold of property, etc. And so going in and basically making deals with people and also accusing them. And it's a bit messy. So you have that as well. So when you're talking about the transfer of wealth, what angle do you want to come? Like, what angle are we looking just through race, which totally there's a lot on that? Are we also looking in terms of gender, even though there was, I think, at least more than a couple of men who were accused of witchcraft in Salem. But what was some of the impetus for, what were some of the different tools people employed to go after land and resources? So I hope Carmen, that answered your question.
Yeah, and I know we're getting down to our last few minutes here, but so I just want to remind folks, we had a few people come on late. You can definitely put your questions in the chat like several people have. You can put them in the Q&A. You can raise your hand. These are your last few minutes to ask questions while we're live here. I wanted to ask a question.
Of course.
As you were researching Lucy Terry's life, were there particular things that really stood out in terms of how she bore witness during her life? Were there particular events or things that really, captured you as you researched her?
I actually only want to know more. Like, there's a big hole for me in terms of like whether or not she has any living descendants. She did have 6 children, but it's questionable in terms of I think only a couple of the unions did produce some children. It's like kind of a bit sketchy in terms of who survived, going back to Lucy Terry Prince. I have to say, her being an orator, a storyteller, like it was common for people to know her as someone who knew the Bible, like backwards and forwards, and like voice and presence. And I think that's something, even though there's not much in terms of her life, there are pieces that Gretchen Holberg Gazina has put together in a beautiful way that helps to paint this picture of presence. There's also, I forget the name of the minister who I think either writes or presents her eulogy, and that kind of paints a picture, like talks about Lucy. So there's a way we get this sense of who she was as this person who had such presence. And I think that's what I come away with. Like, even if it was just one poem and one piece of writing, like if we should be so lucky, something from our life that's hundreds of years later, people are still impacted by it and sharing it and thinking about that. And I think that has wowed me and inspired me in so many different ways. That's a really good question. Thank you, Drew. And let's see, someone did write, also over time, the government had policies that were instrumental in acquiring land for, of course, absolutely, Carmen. That's absolutely true in terms of policies. I mean, like I said, there are so many different veins and ways of looking at distribution of wealth. I think that conversation is happening now in terms of single family zoning, and that conversation about living all over the United States right now. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I wanted to slip in one more question while we had you.
Of course.
I know we were talking before we started tonight about the fact that you're in school right now, and I'm wondering, where you're headed with this work. What's sort of the new things that you're doing research on and interested in?
Thank you. Oh, thank you. So I write across a different bunch of ranges. I am an investigative journalist. I also am a photographer. I write prose and I also write poetry. Right now, part of the reason why I was digging into some of the interviews with former slaves and just like former narrative is just trying to get back to certain parts of heritage for myself, like having grown up in the Northeast. I'm disconnected in a way and dislocated from the South. A lot of my family's in the South. I could go right to the graveyard where they are in Vidalia, where the sweet onion comes from. And so there been this way that I've been trying to fill in a gap, but also think about parts, not just that history though, not just Black history, but thinking about parts of history that is unknowable. So for example, I'm totally obsessed with the man in the iron mask. I was reading something about, was it Mars, the guy who was like his keeper like forever, and like some of those primary sources and the descriptions, and who was that person, and what was the theory behind it, and thinking about history in ways that we don't always consider and always think about, like what goes missing from the narrative, or looking at like a story we tell. Like I was listening to something about King Solomon, and someone who was going to search, everybody has tried to find, right, the mines, and whether or not he was a real person, or was some of that an exaggeration. And so I love doing that as well. And so I think my mind has to do with excavating and looking underneath, and it could be anywhere within world history, or even looking at a fairy tale and saying, here is some link to Beauty and the Beast, which there actually is a true Beauty and the Beast. That's another offshoot. But to answer your question, so those are where some of my interest lies, like looking underneath the surface. What is it that we think we see? Questioning that, and either trying to creatively and respectfully fill in gaps in my creative work, or if I'm doing it as an investigative journalist. I just had a piece in Dame magazine about thinking about Black lives mattering for how long, like, thinking outside the box, don't just remove the cream of wheat man, think about lasting sustainable changes for our whole society. And so when I did that piece, I'm very much rooted in looking at, now, when is the last time we've seen something like this happen? Like looking at the whole history, right, and bringing it together. And so I wrote that piece very much, not just opinion, but rooting it in some history and research. For the poetry side of things, it's a bit different, and I try to inhabit or gather different persona and see what it feels like. I wrote a poem once about Louis XIV. What was it like to be that man who was obsessed with taking a hunting lodge and essentially turning it into like Versailles? Like Versailles was never under scaffold. Like it lived a life under scaffolding because he was obsessed with building. So I wanted to inhabit him to write the poem about him. And so that, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. I think we're just about out of time. And before I turn things back over to Shanta, just for some final concluding thoughts, I just wanted to again thank everybody for joining us tonight after dinner for our first night of Old Stone House Week. I think we've been very fortunate to be able to take part in this presentation tonight. Of course, want to thank Shanta for being our speaker, for kicking off our week, and for doing a really amazing job and some really cool investigative research here, I think.
Thank you.
Just a reminder that all of our sessions for Old Stone House Week are videotaped. So as Joan was asking, you can find them on our website. You can find them on our YouTube channel after they take place if you ever miss one. But we, of course, hope you'll join us again tomorrow night. We have William Edelglass on the history of the concept of race. So definitely a really interesting talk that's coming up tomorrow night. Friday, we'll be doing something special for the kids, so our Kids Friday extravaganza, and then some nice music, of course, on Saturday. So we hope you will all join us again, and I'll turn it back over for some final thoughts from our speaker.
Oh, thank you so much. So all I want to say is I want to encourage people to look beneath the surface of anything, even if it's as simple as wondering how something got its name or what's the story that accompanies something else. It doesn't have to be extravagant. I cannot call myself a historian. I am not. And researcher with somewhat of a little r. Maybe I'll make it to being, you know, full-fledged capital R research. But I have to say, definitely think about different ways that we all want to think about the ways that we want to bear witness. Doesn't have to be, again, as grand as writing a poem, but maybe it's sharing a story and passing a story down. I think there's a lot to be said for oral tradition and how that is a part of building archive. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you again to everybody for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow night or on one of our upcoming nights.
Yes, thank you. And I will follow up with you with that information to share with anybody within a couple of days.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your thoughts. I appreciate it.
Yes, definitely. And I will, you'll be seeing an email from me with Shanta's follow-up.
All right. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good evening.
Have a good